We'll make sure we are live. Pablo's watching also. Just let me make sure we are live.
¿Aló?
Sí, estamos live.
Ahorita estoy viendo.
Okay, we are live in YouTube.
En Instagram todavía no me
Awesome.
aparece.
Okay, I think we're live. And okay, wonderful, guys. We're going live on Instagram now, too. Woo! This is exciting.
So cool.
¿Podrías cambiar el fondo? Okay, excellent. All right, everyone. Okay, wonderful. So just make sure, yes, we are live. Things seem to be working pretty good. And super excited. I am extremely excited for this conversation. I am in Guatemala. Edwin is in the States. Rob is in the States as well. Mm-hmm. And we are up for a really exciting conversation about coffee varieties, stories. I am super pumped because both of you have a ton of experience in the coffee industry, more than most of us have. And I love if maybe you can introduce yourself and share a little bit about where you come from, and yeah, go from there. Let's start
Edwin.
with the Edwin.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just share a little bit about kind of what brought us here to this point, and then you can back it up, Rob, with sharing more some of your background. But I know that you had reached out proactively with interest based on our variety garden, where we had up to 19 varieties. We started planting over a decade ago, and the aim for the variety garden at Finca Vista Hermosa was specifically for learning. So the quantities are not commercially that meaningful. The purpose of the variety garden at Finca Vista Hermosa has been for learning. And so we have all of these varieties that we've planted in the same soil so that we can have the same microclimate, same temperature, same amount of rainfall, same everything. And most importantly, a lot of people don't realize, but the same amount of sun and shade. And so it's not a lot that is split on a ridge on one side or the other. And so our aim is to eliminate as many variables as possible so that we can learn how these varieties perform from an agricultural perspective, from an agronomist perspective, from an economic farmer-producer perspective, with yields and costs, and from a cup quality perspective. So I'll just pass it over to you, Rob. So you had reached out with some curiosity, and you had already been reaching out and connecting with quite a few others, capturing varieties. So this presented a bit of a setup for you. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you've done that's led up to what we're doing. And I think you continue to work on some of these projects, but yeah, share with us.
Yeah. So hi, my name's Rob, and I roast coffee. I also teach people how to roast coffee for a living. So for those of you who don't know me, that's like the short bio. I've been working recently on developing kind of a structure around how I approach roasting different coffee varieties. And the rationale behind it was, the majority of my life in coffee, variety has always been something that people bring up, they mention, and there's a few notable exceptions to different coffee varieties, like, Gesha, or, you hear Typica Bourbon or SL34, or some of these things. And some of them have really good reputations for quality. Some of them have reputations of being more sessionable, I guess you could say, where it's just more of a drinkable coffee, but it's not going to do anything wild for you. But really, I couldn't find very much information out on the internet, in book format, anywhere, on what to expect from different coffee varieties in terms of how they should be tasting. Mm-hmm. So like kind of as a guide for you as a buyer, like, how's this coffee variety going to taste? Like, what kind of things am I expecting from it? So that was missing. And most of my training and upbringing in both the SCA, all the things that I've been self-taught, and the things that I've been mentored in by various people along the way, we would always talk about the importance of processing, and processing was always huge and kind of forefront and center. which makes total sense. And we can go into details on that later as to why processing probably carries so much weight. But then there was also a lot of discussion around terroir, which is really fun to say. It makes you sound pretentious really quick. I guess you could say how the climate where the coffee is grown, the soil where the coffee is grown, how everything around the coffee plant tends to add flavor. But it never really got specific. There was never any like, oh, well, we're doing this because it does X, Y, Z to the flavor. Partly because I don't think that's fully sussed out yet. But then variety was always just kind of this afterthought, unless it was one of the big name varieties. It's like, oh, well, this is a blend of blah, 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 whatever. How could you expect those to taste? Do they taste the same regardless of the region of the world in which they're grown? Do they not taste the same? Is terroir the biggest impactor? So the first thing I wanted to do with this set was like really try and figure out, and so far I've worked with farmers in Papua New Guinea, another farm in Guatemala, 2 different groups in Colombia, and I'm working with one right now in El Salvador. And there's a lot of cross between the different varieties, which is awesome because they're in different countries of origin, different terroir, theoretically. And what I wanted to see is, do they taste similar to one another when planted even completely across the world, or do they not? And then the second aspect of it, because most of my thing is focused on roasting, because that's what I do is train people how to roast coffee, is do certain varieties prefer to be roasted in any particular way? There were a couple of varieties that through experience I came to find out, like, for example, I'm not going to roast a Gesha like I'm going to roast a Katura. That just doesn't work out from experience. But I wanted to really dive into that and figure out, why doesn't that work out? Are there certain generalities we can apply across different cultivars to figure out how we should be approaching roasting them in order to get the best possible outcome? And so that's kind of all of the stuff that I've been doing in the background that's led me to want to work with Edwin and work with Onyx Coffee in this variety garden. Sadly, I wasn't able to buy all 16 varieties because I think I would have driven myself insane trying to do what I was doing in the depth that I did it with all 16 of them. But we were able to get a hold of 8 for this particular experiment. And it's been really cool. It's kind of like my next obsession in coffee, my next thing of personal growth and learning. And eventually, it's not just the box sets, but it's going to boil down to a book, probably early 2025, that approaches this whole concept. So,
okay,
that's a long story. I'm sorry for taking up so much time.
No, that's great. That's it's fascinating, because I think there's some high level assumptions that I would say a lot of people probably would agree with, and then very quickly there's a lot of mystery and question, I think, that we just don't know. And just to put some meat on what I just said there, some of the high level things that come to mind are size, density, and moisture content. And I think those are 3 key things that obviously impact when if you're going to cook anything like in an oven. I'm actually working from home today, so I'm looking over at our oven. And if you cook something that is the same in every way except size, the outcome is going to be different if you apply the same process. And if you have 2 things that are the same size, different density, the outcome is going to be the same in the same process. And then the same with moisture content. But if these variables are taken out, I think the other thing that we don't really know as much about, perhaps you've been able to get some nuance and some insights, is to the chemistry and how each is different in terms of its chemical composition, how it responds to heat. And there's oil in there that has the flavor and the caffeine, and the flavors are different for varieties. So I'm curious. I mean, at a high level, it's probably something that eliminating other variables is probably helpful to make comparison, but these varieties by nature are quite different in size. What you're drinking right now is a pretty large, physically sized bean.
What Edwin's talking about is right now I'm drinking Marigohipe. So for those, because we were talking about it before we got started.
Yes.
From Edwin's farm, of course. I wouldn't be off-brand like that.
So Maragogipe is our largest size bean. Maragogipe, Maragopache, then Pacamara, and they're usually the Maragogipe is a little bit less dense.
Well, so this is where it gets really fun, right? So your Maragogipe was actually one of the denser coffees, but it just depends on how you measure it, right?
Okay.
And so this is where it comes down to like density is not always density. I like to personally use water displacement density readings. And so what I'll do is I'll fill a graduated cylinder. Like if it's a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder, I'll fill it up to 40 milliliters. And then the last 10 milliliters are displaced by coffee. I can weigh that out and then multiply it out to figure out what the actual displacement is. I have to knock the bubbles out and stuff too, but I can figure out what the actual displacement is of the coffee. And the Maragogipe was actually tied for densest coffee of the ones that I purchased from your farm. But in volumetric measurements, where I actually fill a cylinder without water, it was one of the least dense.
Okay.
Because the beans just don't settle well together. They don't fit in as well. So there's a lot more void space due to air. Whereas you get something like a pea berry, they're going to settle in a lot easier.
Yeah.
And you'll end up reading it as a denser coffee, even if it maybe isn't.
So would that be similar to, I'm just thinking of ground coffee. If you grind really fine, you might have the same initial amount that would pack into a smaller space, whereas a coarse would have a lot of air. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just eliminating the airspace. And what's been kind of fun too for me is, and this is where the experiments that I've done, the actual experiments, I'm going to be relying a lot on my own experience before that too, because all the coffee farms that I've been buying from are all decently high altitude, and they're all producing quite dense coffees. So it's kind of like, I don't have, for example, like a low altitude Maragogipe that's like super low density to compare against all the Maragojipes that I've gotten. I think I've had 3 or 4 across the box set series. All of them were really high density, high grown Maragojipes. And so it's like, well, a high grown Maragogipe is obviously going to perform very differently than a low altitude Maragogipe would. And the density is going to be different, everything like that. So there are some limitations just because I've been buying from really good quality, high altitude coffee farms in this process. So that is one of the interesting caveats. But yeah, in terms of density measurements, part of the reason I started doing water displacement was it would drive me nuts. Like if green coffee sinks and water is 1 gram per milliliter, then it's 1,000 grams per liter is the density of water. And the coffee has to be denser than water for it to actually sink.
Right.
So when we're talking about coffee and we're saying, oh, my Cynar says it's 864 grams per liter, or this volume tube that I'm using says it's 750 grams per liter. All of that is suggesting that the coffee is actually less dense than water. However, it is the ISO approved way to measure coffee density currently. Where I like the water displacement is I get measurements that are usually around like 1170, so 1,170 grams per liter, up above 1290, so 1,290 grams per liter. So I'm able to see the coffees performing in a measurement that seems more realistic because it's actually appropriately higher density than water.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad we're recording this, and this is on YouTube live to capture for people to be able to just go back and replay that. And so I just want to repeat that last part. So the density measurement in water gives you the result that logically makes sense why it sinks.
Yep. The downside is I do have to sacrifice, around 12 to 13 grams of coffee in order to make the measurement because of what I'm displacing. But currently I've been trying so far, mostly unsuccessfully, to get any of the coffee beans that I've submerged to germinate. And so I've got all these experiments going in the background that you can't see of me trying to grow coffee plants.
Well, you just brought back some really crazy memories from maybe 17, 18 years ago, roasting in a Huki roaster at Vista Hermosa with some buyers that were really eager to taste coffees that were picked just a couple days prior. And so the moisture content is not ready. And so There was a whole nother approach on roasting to get it to the moisture content you want on green before you start roasting, just to get it there. And then either continue or just let it rest and then roast after roasting it to, I don't know, say 11% moisture content to get it to that point from wherever it was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And moisture content is another big critical, like high level thing, kind of what you mentioned, the big ones earlier: density, moisture content, and can't remember the other one. There's three, I know at least.
Size?
But, sorry, what? Oh, size. Yeah.
Size,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, with the moisture content, one of the ways that I've always looked at it is if the moisture content's above a certain point, based on some of the research that Ian Freetham at Cafe Imports has done, there's a parallel between moisture content and water activity. And so super high moisture contents are going to be also high water activities, which tend to cause the coffees to age out a lot faster. So the higher the water content, the higher the water activity, theoretically, the faster it's going to age. But then from a roaster's perspective, it's also a lot harder to roast wetter coffees because the water absorbs so much additional heat energy. And so it just really slows things down. So it can be really challenging to get the roast to flow properly or flow to your plan when you're roasting wet coffees.
Yeah.
Not to mention the flavor differences, but yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, until you get momentum and then it really speeds up and takes off on you.
It can, yeah. And part of that too is just the way heat gets trapped not trapped, but the way heat flow works in the machine. Because if you're driving it super hard the whole time and then you have to lay off, it's really, really hard to be able to do that well because you've got so much hot airflow moving through the machine already. So then you got to get every bit of heat energy out of the hot box. You've got to get the drum temperature down. You've got to get everything down in order to stabilize and be able to have a good development time to a light roast level. So it can get really challenging.
Yeah. So I'm curious if there's any other, as you just shared with density and the water test, I'm curious if there's any other, perhaps assumptions that maybe you had that you tested and found something counter to what you expected, or maybe counter not to what you expected, but what a lot of people expect. And I'll give you a minute to think on that while I give an example. Behind Oscar right now, on Oscar's right is, you see, there's something I see a lot at farms that's really interesting, and it's something that I think it's like a magic trick. Once you know how it's done, there's nothing magical about it, but until you know how it's done, it's unexplainable. And so we have a lot of coffee that, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but you can see when you're floating coffee in water, there are rocks that will sink, and we'll have in a water canal some speed bumps that will catch those. And then on the top, there's all sorts of things that float. And so this is a very basic way that works really well. It can work really well to sort things that are of different density, is exactly what this is doing. Some funny things happen though. We have some coffee that's really good, that looks nice, and it's floating. It's very clearly floating. And 9 times, if not 10 times out of 10, I can pick one of these that look perfectly ripe, that you might think, why is this one floating? And inside, usually you have 2 beans, unless it's a pea berry. But on these, when you open it, you'll have 2 beans. And if you squeeze them, one of them has nothing in it. And that's why it's floating. And so part of our processing is we have coffee that looks really nice that's floating, that we also will separate, that could be a really high quality. But it gets sorted out because there's a lot of other things that are floating that aren't going to be what we want. So I'm curious if there's anything like this where you have something that's deceiving or that's misleading, or where there's an assumption that looking a little closer shows you something different or insightful.
Yeah, and first, before I go into that, I'll hop on what you're saying. I've worked with some producers in Guatemala who've separated out their floaters and then snuck them onto the table, because we cupped through their whole farm. Some good friends of mine, 250 coffees in 5 days, and often they would sneak on the table their floaters. And we would not have picked them out.
Yeah.
Like, they were good. And they were classically thrown away or used for in-country coffee or called segundo and given a lower price or whatever. They were good, and they deserve to have a higher price. And so you're absolutely right on the money with that. It's like, you wouldn't expect it, but it's because people just go along with the way things have always been. And, that's kind of how it goes. And I guess one of those things I'll drop in on, and people probably heard me talk about this before, so hopefully it's not too much of a broken record, but like, density and altitude, the two are not necessarily connected. They can be. Oftentimes higher altitude coffee is higher density, but I had the pleasure of buying from Caravala a coffee from the Galapagos, grown at 200 meters. And it was every bit as dense as some natural process Kenyans that I had been buying that were grown at 1,500 meters and were like SL28, SL34 cultivars. And it was a Bourbon Typica blend, and it tasted amazing. And the density was just mind-blowing, because it's like 200 meters, this is going to be low density. Well, because of the ocean currents, it keeps a very mild climate there. And because of the shade growth that they're using, it helps prevent the trees from overproducing, going wild, stuff like that. And so they're able to use the temperature on their island and the shade cover that they have to basically give the plants the same experience they would be having at higher altitudes. And so the plant matures more slowly, it grows fewer fruits, it produces a higher density coffee than I would have ever expected coming from 200 meters. And it was really good. And so that's definitely one of the things where it's like, if a producer knows what they're doing, they can produce really nice, good quality, dense coffee regardless of their altitude. With some exceptions, you can't go to like Death Valley in the United States and grow coffee regardless of what you do, because it's just too dang hot. You plant as much shade growth as you want, and it's probably not going to do much. But if you have the ability to use shade to manage your temperatures, you can really produce some really good quality coffee various places. So that was definitely mind-blowing to me.
I had a similar experience with, and I do agree that often density is tied to elevation, but really I think the non-negotiable that is a strongly correlated with density is going to be simply rate of growth, something that develops slowly. And so generally at a higher elevation, fruit develops slower. And so then you have this assumption that a higher elevation is more dense, which is usually correct. And we can get really into the weeds with nuance and cupping, but a lot of times I'm just trying to keep it simple. Is this hot? Is this liquid? Do I like it? Is it washed or not? Is it clean?
If it's not hot and liquid, you've done something really wrong.
Well, I think it's just good to start with some things that you can be absolutely confident about. And you build confidence in tasting and a cupping when, I just said 5 things that I am 100% sure about. How many more words can I be 100% sure about? And so one thing I often do is I'll mentally, and I can't not do this anytime I taste coffee, even if I'm at just getting a cup of coffee at a breakfast place, I immediately decide what elevation it was grown at every time. And so I feel I can more predictably tell you the elevation something was grown at than I can what country it came from, just blindly tasting coffee. But I tried in Los Angeles at the Convention Center Coffee Fest earlier this year. Good boy Bob had Marcus got a coffee grown in California, not in Death Valley, but this is not too far from Santa Barbara. And the elevation, I don't recall what it is. It's not 2,000 meters. It's not 1,000. It's probably somewhere in the low hundreds is my guess. 200 or 300, 400 at the most, 500 maybe. And it tasted a lot higher. It was also a geisha. It was also naturally processed. So like some very different things happening, but the intensity of the acidity to to me spoke clearly that it was from a much higher elevation than where it came from. And so I was talking with Marcus about this, and our conclusion was that it's a mix of, shade will slow down growth, but having a constant cool air. Because what we find is at our higher elevations at 2,200 meters above sea level, it's just often too cold, and the coffee is it struggles, and it's not very productive for us. And so I think having a constant cool breeze causes some similar struggle to be productive, and effectively slows down the development and produces a denser bean at a lower elevation where you wouldn't expect it to come from.
For sure.
And it was a good coffee. It was really good. But what was mind-blowing is that it tasted like it was easily 1,000 meters higher than where it came from.
Do you think it has something to do with the variety? Like, for example, you have 16 different varieties planted almost at the same altitude. Did you find certain varieties perform better for you or were stronger compared to others?
On this example that I tried, the density on a geisha usually is not a dense bean. In fact, it's a very delicate bean that usually I'd rather have it washed because it's delicate. But on our farm, I don't know. That's very interesting, Rob. You found the Maragogipe to have tied for the highest density. What was the other one, and what was the least dense?
Let me look here real quick because I can tell you super fast.
Okay.
Maragogipe was 1290, and Typica was also 1290.
Typica, okay.
The the Caturra was the lowest density.
Interesting.
And then Gesha, Pacamara, and Bourbon were all pretty close to one another.
And the Caturra was the lowest density.
It was, yeah. Yeah, it was 1208.
Okay.
And just kind of for reference too, the if I look at what I did with the density tube, the Maragogipe was 715 grams per liter versus 1,290 grams per liter based on doing the water displacement. And so the Caturra, which was the lowest density on water displacement, actually had a density of 742.7 grams per liter. So it was significantly more dense than the Maragogipe without using water. So it's always just interesting to see how those kind of flop around. Yeah.
We have in every lot at least 2 to 3 varieties. So that's an interesting thing that I know that for roasting, ideally you want uniformity in size, density, moisture content. And I think, the process can be consistent to get uniformity in moisture content. The size is what it is. Moisture content is a result of the human process control. But the size and the density are not. And so if the moisture is constant, then having not too broad an array in the density and the moisture has got to be helpful for roasting in terms of consistency.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and one of the off things too with that Caturra, I don't know if you recall, but there was something with DHL where the moisture wasn't on arrival what it was when it left the farm.
Right.
So with the Caturra, so there was something that happened there that was strange, but that could be part of it as well.
Yeah, so less dense is going to be more prone to absorbing or losing moisture.
Yeah, so that could be some of what we experienced. Yeah. Yeah. That being said, one of the other surprises, and I think part of me knows where Oscar's wanting to go with this. Which coffee did you like better off of the, which one seems to perform better on your farm? I've got an easy answer for you, but I'll get to that. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what performs better for you, but I know what I prefer taste-wise.
Okay.
And I'm drinking it right now. I love the Marigot Hipe. It's just a really fun, and there was only 6 pounds of it from the Variety Garden this year. But it's just a really fun, really nice, enjoyable coffee. And that brings me to kind of one of the other things that's really surprising to me about the big three: the size, density, and moisture content. And that is that traditional knowledge has said, like, bigger beans, you got to go slower. You got to slow down. They're going to not do well if you roast them quickly. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the old literature refers to both Pacamara and Marigot Hipe as very savory, valued just for their large bean size, stuff like that. Whereas what I found is that for Marigot Hipe and Pacamara, at least, they actually tend to prefer really fast roasting styles. So hitting first crack a lot quicker than one might expect. And even with development times, like classically I was trained like, oh, they're big beans, so you need a lot longer in development to make sure that the heat goes through to the middle.
Yeah.
Not the case. So
interesting.
like with both of them, I'm hitting first crack closer to 7.5 minutes, and I'm doing like only 1:15 to 1:30 development time. And they are just fruity as all get out, really nice bright acidity, floral tones, cool, amazing balance, good body still, even though they're roasted fast, which is kind of why I enjoy them a lot. And so that's been a learning process for me ever since getting Marigot Hipe from Vikram at Benchmark Coffee from Papua New Guinea. That was one of the first ones I really dove in deep on years ago, and was just like, holy crap, this variety has got a lot going on. Or culture, I should say, but yeah. So that's my favorite off your farm. However, I didn't taste a bad variety off your farm either, or cultivar. So.
Okay, well, this is really interesting. I always appreciate feedback, because part of, as I mentioned, the process and purpose is not just learning about what's resistant, what's going to be high yielding, what's easy to manage, but cup quality is really important. Mm-hmm. And they're all in tandem, I think, important to look at. I think for us, in having a farm, it's important, as we work with a lot of producers, to focus on data and information and sharing, which is different than saying you should or shouldn't do this or that. It's just, here's information, so that people can have, the more information you have about your product, the more you can make better decisions. Mm-hmm. Similarly, as we work with small and mid-sized producers, the more predictability we can provide really is giving them, not just farmers, but working with roasters as well, as much as possible, to provide more insight into the future, more information that allows better decision making today. And so piecing, in this case, for example, I'm always taking notes of what people's preferences are, and then I like to dig deeper on those, on the economics, because I know that at Onyx, if we take all of our most expensive coffees, which would be our gems that we're scoring at 87 points or higher, and trying to hold that as a minimum, we're selling those for more because we're paying more. But the math behind it, more often than not, the higher, even much higher prices often don't cover the cost of production. And so really, it's an investment in education. It's a showcasing of what's possible. And it really is an investment in relationships where economically the businesses and all the rest of the coffee, and doing a really good job in farm management overall. And then being calculated with some experiments that can be really, really insightful. And so I like to take ideas and scale them out and exaggerate them to see what would happen if we got rid of absolutely everything and just planted Marigot Hipe.
You have a bad time, I think.
Yeah. But the thing is, when you fill in that blank with one thing and one thing only, then you can more clearly see the big highs and lows on why it really makes sense or why it really does not make sense, very, very quickly. Which I think it's just good to have a healthy perspective. Yeah.
And I can't remember who the person was that gave this talk. I was at an SCA trade show years ago. I believe they were from Counterculture, but I'm not totally sure. They gave a talk on how cherry picking really nice, cherry picking, no pun intended, really nice coffees at farms wasn't actually making an impact on the producers' lives. Part of the argument was, well, if you remove these 10 bags of really exceptional 89-point coffee from this overall lot, how much does the overall lot score suffer? And would the overall lot with those included actually get a higher price for more volume of coffee? And so because 10 bags doesn't change anybody, unless they're a really small producer, it's probably not actually changing their lives. But paying substantially higher prices, or even just moderately higher prices for a larger quantity of coffee actually makes a tremendous difference in people's livelihoods. And
I have a feeling that may have been Peter Giuliano.
I don't think it was Peter that did it that time, but it was someone else. But but it nonetheless, it's amazing talking points, like this thought of, I think a lot of the times our industry does a really good job of patting itself on the back. When it really doesn't deserve to, because it's like, oh, look at us, we're paying these really high prices for these coffees, and it's like, well, what about all your blenders that you're actually selling the higher volumes of? Because with a lot of companies I've worked with in the past, I think our light roast single origin really accounted for maybe about 10 to 20% of volume, and then there was everything else, right? And so
and ultimately, I think good partnerships often are looking at all of it, not just the everything else, or not everything but the everything else, but all of it, and finding ways to work long term with that. I've heard a lot of importers use this phrase, and it's kind of to encompass this idea of buying the mountain, and not cherry picking. And that's valuable, because then you can have a conversation that takes all of the information into consideration. And if the aim is to have a positive outcome, then you catch these things that maybe are going to really skew the picture if they're not a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'll throw something random out there as we're talking about this, and hopefully this doesn't take us too far off piece. One of the things that I've learned throughout the course of these box sets is that different varieties don't perform as well when roasted the same. Different cultivars don't perform as well when roasted the same as another cultivar. So it's kind of this idea that one size fits all does not work for coffee. And I think a lot of us know this from just experience, but I kind of want to highlight the fact that if I were to roast a Bourbon like I would approach roasting a Gesha, the Bourbon is going to show up as thinner. It's going to show up as maybe a little papery or starchy. It's not going to have the body that I would expect it to have, and it might even have some certain astringencies to it. Whereas if I roast that same Bourbon in a way that is in keeping with what I've seen the variety or the cultivar prefer, not that I want to personify it, but here we go. It seems to prefer a different roasting style, and when I actually go that route with it, I can get really nice fruits. I can get little hints of florals. I can get a really nice body, and I can get rid of that paperiness. I can get rid of that starchy characteristic that's distracting and unpleasant. And one of the things that I think is potentially detrimental that we as roasters do is apply a one-size-fits-all to everything. Now, where this gets really tricky, and I don't know the answer to it, is coffee buying. We have a set roast profile that we do for all of our sample roasting. We evaluate coffees off that sample roast, and we choose this coffee versus this coffee. And at the same time, nothing exists in a bubble. So I wonder too how much of which cultivar is in vogue or which one seems to score higher, all these different things that we claim to be objective and are actually subjective and are at the fits of whatever the popular style of sample roasting is during that time. Because everybody's going faster and faster and faster, and not all the varieties actually like to be roasted faster. So I kind of want to throw that in as we're talking about fairness and as we're talking about, like, you know, a lot of the times Bourbon, Caturra, and Bourbon and Caturra variants are the primary bread and butter large volume coffees, and they tend to do better with slower roasting styles. And so how much of our slant against them toward these really nice coffees has to do with a change in how people sample roast.
There is a reality where, like, and this is true at Finca Vista Hermosa, where many farms, and I would just say probably most farms in Guatemala at least, you have 2 or more varieties in any lot. There are farms. I know El Injerto has been intentional here in the last few years and the next few years to have a really clear separation, which will make it increasingly interesting, I think, to do this deeper kind of analysis. Because a lot of coffee that are, you know, very focused from a very specific lot might still be 2 or 3 or more varieties. But that doesn't mean that there's real data behind them. I got this vision when you were saying earlier, personifying coffee. I feel like you should write a comic book, Rob, that actually has bean cartoon characters, and each one has a name, and the name is the cultivar or variety, and it says, this is what I like in terms of how I like to be roasted. Like when I go and sit in a sauna or in a hot tub, capturing this idea of personification. I don't know, it's interesting because I think sometimes the most effective education is when, one, it makes sense to someone and it's memorable. And I think things that are personal are generally more memorable than, I don't know, some people really love data, no offense, but I can't look at too much raw data without context and having a personal element.
I say if money were no object, I'd say we should reach out to the creators of Bluey and see if we could get them to do an animation kids cartoon about coffee cultivars for us, because then it would stick with everybody.
Yeah.
But, yeah. No, I do think that, you know, it's true. Like there's personification, I think, helps us to empathize with and remember what might be going on. And sometimes there's just no easier way to talk about it than personifying something. But I do think it's really interesting too, because like there's this weird feedback loop where on the buying end of things, we create this weird feedback loop with the producing end where we're like, well, we want this and we'll pay money for this. And then this comes around and we're like, oh, actually we want this. And it just kind of keeps seeming like it's changing and it's inconsistent. And, you know, I wonder how much of it is because of this lack of holistic communication from end to end, because everything's kind of siloed in the coffee industry just because of how the market has always worked out. Like, and because of all the extraction of value that's happened classically over the years. But because of that, there's no real good closed feedback system that exists. And so I think some of this stuff is a little bit harder to suss out or to figure out how it would actually shift.
Yeah. Well, really grateful, Rob, for the work you're doing and just the curiosity and passion you have. I think this data is incredibly valuable, and it is hard over time because you're right. I think there's this extractive reality that's also magnified by the time cycle for decisions. If you think of what are the most important decisions that a farmer, an exporter, an importer, a roaster, a retailer, and then ultimately a consumer when it comes to coffee. And a consumer, to go to one extremity, is thinking, where should I go today? now I'm at this place. What should I order right now? And then the cafe is thinking about, what do we need to order for this week or next week? And what are the things that we need to think are long-term planning? Maybe we're going to order, maybe this is more into the roaster, we're going to order cups in bulk. And so now we're talking about big picture, long-term annual cycles. And that's where an exporter or importer starts. And for a farmer, that's very short-term thinking. And so when you have communication with these different time cycles, it's complicated. It's complicated because the implications and the risk are very imbalanced, I think. And so this data, I think, is really helpful to better understand the product and to calibrate more on specific and meaningful things, having more context about really overall cost of production for a farmer, and for a roaster or retailer to have the context of knowing what their customer likes and wants as much as possible, which oftentimes for a roaster is what their customers like is not maybe what they would like them to like as much, but that's what's driving the business. And so I think both of those are important to communicate, and then pairing this with more understanding of the product. It's all very valuable information to be as clear as possible about back to the producer level. What are you working on next? You said you're aiming to share and do some fun things in 2025. I'm just curious, just wrapping up here, what 18 months look like for you?
Well, so right now I'm finishing up the last of the box sets. This one I'm working on is from Emilio Lopez in El Salvador. Farm name La Cumbre, and it's a wash, a honey, and then 4 naturals. Okay. So kind of rounding out the box set series by looking at how processing impacts flavor and how it impacts roasting and that sort of thing as well. I've started writing the big book where I'm going to just kind of take all of this information down. What I want to do is create something that's a little bit more like a reference manual for, here's this variety, here's what flavors I'm expecting, here's a good way to approach roasting it so that I can land in a place where I'm happy with it within the first couple roasts. Because there's no such thing as one size fits all. And, my goal is really just to help people shortcut. So instead of having to do 7 or 8 different profile roasts to figure out how to land somewhere where you're happy, you can use some of the reference materials that I create in order to hit where you're happy in 1 or 2 roasts and save yourself time and product, and really just kind of have a different way of looking at things too. So that's in process. That's probably not going to be till early 2025 for that. And then, after that, who knows what's next? I am used to thinking further out, as you said, because being a roaster and also working direct with producers, it's always like I'm thinking a year out, 2 years out, hopefully, but I'm not actually that organized. So for this set and for this series, the Cultivated Variety series, I was thinking over a year out, but now that it's wrapping up and then the book's wrapping up, I'm like, okay, so, doing a lot more in-person stuff probably. I'll be focusing a lot more on in-person classes and online course content. Just kind of keep that up. I'm going to keep doing some fun projects here and there coffee-wise because I love sharing roasted coffee with people and just seeing how it changes their minds about stuff. So I'm always going to be producing some sort of roasted coffee, I'm sure. And it keeps me from getting cobwebs all over my skills. So
yeah, the forum that I joined where you kind of unpacked some of the learnings in this box set with the Vista Hermosa coffees, there were people in there from all over the world.
Yeah, we had 16 different countries represented. Yeah.
So that is fascinating. Just getting perspectives and having people tasting the same thing, that you know that the everyday flavors that you're trying in different parts of the world, are very, very different, and to all be coming together tasting the same thing is very interesting.
And that's also why it's my favorite too, because people are always going to be like, actually, and I encourage this, people shouldn't agree with me all the time. It would be so boring if everyone just agreed. But we'll get on these calls and somebody will be like, this is my favorite coffee. And then other people will be like, no, actually I like this one. Or, because I present like an optimized version as well as a baseline roast. Sometimes people like my baseline roast better than the one that I considered optimized. And that's totally fair because so much of coffee roasting is preference. The goal is really just to be able to understand how to get the flavors that you want out of a particular coffee, so that you can present them to your customers, whatever that may be. If everybody roasted for my particular preference, I think we'd all be out of business because it doesn't reflect the larger consumer base. And I will say too, I do know that planning wise, I've got a lot of experiments lined up for dark roasting. I've written a book on dark roasting, but I'm going to be diving more into that here soon. And I've also been playing around with double roasting, which I know is anathema, and I should never bring it up in the industry. But I've actually had some really good results from roasting light roasted coffee a second time to a medium or dark roasted level, just for the sake of donations here locally. Because after I do a roasting project like this box set, I probably end up with 40 pounds of roasted coffee that's too old for me to sell to the specialty market, just because I've been tasting through it and it's in flux, it's in progress.
Yeah. And
so what I do is I re-roast it for the local market here where I live in Rainier, Oregon, because everybody here tends to prefer darker roasted coffees. And it's been a massive hit and people love it. And so I'm able to donate it to the schools. I'm donating it to the softball association. It's just getting all over the place. I've got one wholesale account. There's a bakery here in town, and I'm really just doing it for the cinnamon rolls, if I'm being honest. But, it's been really fun. And I think that there's some stuff to really unpack there. And I'm not an originator of double roasting. It's existed for a long time, both in the home roasting community as well as in roasting communities elsewhere. So it's just kind of something new and fun to play around with. So those are my two things coming up. Dark roasting and double roasting are going to be taking more of a center stage for my experiments coming up.
Oh, well, I'm sure you'll get a lot of people that maybe disagree and are curious. And
I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. I was in LA last week, or I guess this week, San Francisco last week. Popped in last minute. I saw Julie Hausch mentioned a coffee value assessment talk that Peter Giuliano was going to do. And so we went last minute, Cody and I, and it was at Verve's Roastery in the Arts District in downtown LA, or near downtown LA. And I left with more questions than clarity, but one curious and exciting takeaway was that there's a plan to essentially gather data, and I'd like to circle back, and Oscar, maybe we can do a talk with Peter on this, but there's an aim for getting feedback from, I believe it was 10,000 people, industry people that are somehow in QC with green and roasted. So importers, exporters, roasters, green buyers, and getting feedback that the coffee value assessment captures like a discriminative, descriptive, and effective. And so the first one is just, can you tell the difference? It's like a triangulation. This is different from this because it's more of whatever or less acidity than this. And so you're just by comparison. The descriptive is really what we think of with flavor notes. It's like when we're describing something. And then the last one, effective, is more preference. But there's a graph, almost like with an X and Y axis, that plots out how much people like the descriptive, and it plots it out how much people like them. And so to me, it's interesting because that can actually be valuable information for the whole supply chain, but at the producer level to at least know that in this part of the world, these are the results. People are consistently, generally liking these flavor descriptors. And then in this part of the world, we see people are generally liking these flavor descriptors. Because what it does is it's some raw data. It's not saying that one is better than the other, but it's saying this number of people in this part of the country or this part of the world really like. And so when it comes to putting value on coffee, it's not that there's an objective necessarily value, but there's the market, of course, that is the large driver, but to at least know there's some preference drivers that impact that contribute to giving value.
Yeah. The challenging part will be that this is still professionals that are giving the evaluation, right? Because they're the ones using the form. And so it's still going to be skewed in a certain way, I feel like.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. And that's kind of the big question that I had leaving, thinking, okay, is this really a much broader research data gathering endeavor to more accurately capture consumer and non-professional, because that's who drives the business? And is that data going to reflect the same results or something totally different? It's not going to be the same, maybe similar, more in some areas than others, but I think it'd be surprising to see how big the gaps might be.
Yep. Yeah, I think it really just calls for us all to be a little bit more honest with ourselves, right? So, and who our customers actually are, and, you know, yeah, trying not to force people to try and like something that they don't like, because we want them to like it, and really just understand what they actually like, and be able to provide that, as well as an opportunity to see something different. Like, I think that's what drives a lot of us, is like, we want people to be able to experience the same joy that we experience from tasting particular coffee. But sometimes the shoe just doesn't fit, and that's okay too. Yeah.
I'm still going to stubbornly be persistent to share the joys that I most like with people. Yeah, I think just finding the opportunity, where I think with what you're doing, a lot of the value is hard to measure, but it's the value of education, where it challenges. It's not saying that what someone likes is right or wrong, but when you taste more things and start to appreciate the differences, then over time, there's opportunity, I think, for there to be some migrating of preference. Because if you take a few steps back, nobody likes coffee. That's a really big, bold statement. The first time you try it, nobody likes alcohol. Nobody that has ever smoked anything liked it the first time, right?
Yep. Yeah, I don't know. That is a big, bold statement. I like it, but I don't know how I feel about it.
I have 3 boys, and when I look at their faces, at first it's like this reaction. It's not a I'm happy face. It's a little bit unpleasant, and then it comes around.
Yeah. I will say I have videos of my daughter when she was like 1, just like slamming coffee and just being like, coffee, more coffee, please. So maybe not everybody, but yeah, no, I can. Yeah. Or it was just she was hooked on the caffeine early somehow. So.
Yeah, there's just acquired tastes with things that are different. Even we didn't give carbonated, sugary, like soda beverages to our kids, but when we first did, I caught it on video, and I think it was mostly the carbonation that was a shock. But the amount of, and so it was very, very unpleasant the first few times, but they kept coming back really quick. And the reason was, I think, the sugar. And then all of a sudden you're very comfortable with this disruptive, bubbly stuff, and you're wanting to chug as fast as you can, despite the carbonation slowing you down because sugar.
Yep.
All right. Well, we're just about at an hour here, so we should wrap up. But thank you so much, Rob. Any final thoughts, Rob, Oscar?
I mean, I'm just appreciative of your time and using this platform with your audience to talk coffee with me. I had a blast, and I'm always around and available. So if people ever need, you can just find me at host.coffee as my website, or at Rob Hosts on social media. That's it.
Yeah, thanks for joining. This was this very exciting live, and learn a ton. And thanks you, Rob and Edwin, for joining. This was looking forward to do more of this.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. Have an awesome Friday and a great weekend.
Yeah, you as well.
Gracias.
Okay.